Great. This is part of a series that I've been doing along with Jill in the library at B'nai, titled People of the Book. June is known as the Hebrew Book Week, or the Hebrew Book Month in Israel. And in honor of that, I wanted to really focus and dedicate the time to learn about Israeli literature or Hebrew literature. And today we're connecting history and literature, which I love because I love history. And we are discussing the development of Hebrew literature up until today, and the Israeli literature, talking about the different things that were developed and added over time through the ages. So from the Bible up until today, and different developments that have happened over the years and over the time. Great. So I will just note that in the previous session, and Alice, if you're interested in receiving the recording, I have that as well. We spoke about where the term People of the Book comes from, and we also spoke about the Hebrew Book Week, where that originates, and also the Jewish Book Month, and where that originates, and kind of comparing and contrasting between the two. So we really were talking about the whole idea of this month, and talking more about where that came from. And today I'm talking about Israeli literature in its entirety, when that began and how it's developed up until today. Great. Okay, so the first thing that we have when we're talking about Hebrew literature is the Bible. This is the Bible that something like this I received also when I finished elementary school, also when I swore into the army. It really is the book of books, the classic of the Jewish people, and also of two other monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam, that base their original sources on the Bible. And not only does it have stories that we still see references of today, whether it is the story of Solomon and the cutting the two babies in half, or Noah and the ark, or splitting of the sea, we see references all the time. Or whether it's talking about morals and basing that, to tikkun olam and to today. Really, this is the original book in Hebrew, and the original sources we have that give us a wide variety of content already in this book. So this book was written, according to many scholars, over a long period of time, but we're basically talking about minus 1,200 more or less, up until minus 165 more or less. So again, this is more scholarly opinions about when this was written and canonized. But of course, if you're talking about religious perspective, the stories happened in different times. They say that the earth was founded, 6,000 years ago, or wherever it is, according to the Hebrew calendar. So take the years themselves as a scholarly view, and that obviously there's different opinions to that as well. So that's where we start from in our journey of Hebrew literature. It starts with the Bible. It starts with the stories that we are all used to and grew up on that are in the Bible. Next, we have from the canonization of the Bible up until the 7th century, which covers a lot of time, but this is where we see not that many changes, but there is a few things that are noteworthy to mention as well. So we first of all have, and I put this, I'll point it out what I'm talking about, so feel free to move your screens if you don't see what I'm talking about, but this picture right over here on the top right is the Maccabim book. It's the book talking about the story of Hanukkah, which actually, and also the Hashmonaim generally, the Maccabees generally, and their whole story of when they had sovereignty in the land of Israel for a period of 70 years, by the way. So always when I was in high school and it was approaching the year 70, my teachers would always make sure to claim, just so you should know, we already were survived 70 years during the time of Hanukkah, more or less, and we didn't survive. So 70, and the fact that we're 73 now is a big deal. But at the same time, it goes to show you how things can be very volatile when it comes to self-rule and autonomy. So this book is from about minus 164, and happening in the land of Israel, but just wasn't decided to be put in the Bible. So is, as I mentioned before, in the Bible goes to about minus 165, but this book again was not placed in it. So that's something else that we have, that it's additional books that are at the time of the Bible and happened around that time, but that they didn't actually go into the book itself. In addition, we have around in the year 200, and I see you raised your hand, Tybal, so one moment, I'll just finish what I'm saying and then I'm happy to hear. So around 200, the Mishnah was canonized and written down more or less. So up until that point, we have oral law developing in various places. In the two centers, we have one in Jerusalem and one in Babylonia that are developing over time. However, for the Mishnah, it was all in Israel, so it's all in Hebrew. So that's why I put the word Mishnah here on the bottom right. And we have various Jewish commentary that's developing as well. But at the same time, up until the 7th century, we have the Mishnah. The Talmud was mostly made in Aramaic, which is why I wrote Mishnah here regarding Hebrew specifically. And we have, again, various Jewish commentary that's religious discussion and historical or stories generally, if you want to talk about that regarding the Bible, that are happening at this point. Now, one more thing that I want to note, which is unique, is this person over here, which is Josephus, or Yosef ben Matityahu, who was a Kohen, and he's from the Roman times, so during the destruction of the Second Temple. So we're talking about the 1st century that he lived, more or less. And his story is pretty unique. So he started out as a Kohen who served in the temple during the time of the Second Temple. And when the Romans were coming and conquering, he had the opinion that they should just let the Romans take over and agree to, how do you call it? Likana. What is it? How do you say the word when you, trying to find the word now? when you just let a nation come in. Surrender. Thank you. That's the word. Bless you. So we should surrender to the Romans. And he actually was taken as a prisoner of war in front of Titus, and he fought for his life and was taken. It was this, and in the pretty much of a miracle, they didn't kill him, but kept him as a prisoner of war and used him as an historian to write about the Jews, basically. So the idea behind this is that he became a Jewish historian. So some Jews at the time, or a lot of Jews at the time, saw him as a traitor, someone who saw Jerusalem burn up in flames by the Romans and convincing his fellow Jews to surrender to the Romans. On the other hand, if you're looking at it from a historical perspective and what he did, he created something new in Hebrew, which was for the first time an official history book. So this is in a question mark, because the only book that they say he possibly wrote in Hebrew is the Jewish Wars. And he has other books that he's written about the Jewish people over time, and also against Apion, which is basically refuting opinions of people who are not Jewish about the Jewish people. So he's written about all these different things, but it was mostly in Greek. It's the language of the Romans. Okay. No, what? Latin? Okay, thank you. So it was mostly written in Latin in that case, and not in Hebrew, or it was written in Aramaic. But the Jewish Word is the only book that is claimed, that some opinions say that it was originally written in Hebrew. And in that case, we have a source that was written in Hebrew, and for the first time, a complete purpose of its historical book. It's not meant to be the Bible, which is about the nation, but it really is a purely historical book. Now, some people, again, don't completely claim that it was originally in Hebrew. What's interesting is that somebody who studied Jewish history, his books are one of the few original sources we have from that Second Temple period. We don't have other sources because most of them were burnt, so or ruined or destroyed or not kept over time. So therefore, he has become such an important person in history because the Romans actually preserved all the things that he wrote. He was writing for the Roman Empire, and actually they preserved his books in that case. So Tybal, did you want to say something?
Sure. Though first, let me say, unfortunately, I call Verizon the pharaoh of utilities, and Verizon's dropping me in and out. So I apologize if you ask people to hold questions. Is it okay to ask?
Yeah, feel free.
Okay. And you may have said, but this may be my arithmetic or it may be Verizon, but I just had occasion to look up my recollection. This was about a week ago. I looked it up. My recollection is that the book of Daniel is the latest one. Scholars think is the latest. And the latest thing I saw dated the book of Daniel to the Hebrew year, I think 3295.
Okay.
Which, when you take off the difference Hebrew and whatever, one gets 465. But I thought I heard you say 165.
So it could be that the book of Daniel is from 465, but the actual canonization of the Bible itself is from around that time. So again, you have a lot of different stories. And also don't forget that the story like Maccabim, like the Maccabim book for Hanukkah was considered to be in the book of the Bible, but it was not in the end. So
right, yeah. You know what? I think I apologize. I think it's when Verizon ducked out. I thought you were talking about the latest book in the Bible, but you were talking about the canonization overall. I get it. Thank you.
No, it's an important note because I did my research for this, but it's always important to hear other people, and I know that you have a lot of knowledge as well, so I really appreciate it.
And if it's okay. I know not chat or whatever, but the six or seven different sources I use, like traditional ones, I think it's something called Sefer HaOlam, in translation though, Art Scroll, but I'm always interested to know what sources people use for dating. So if there's anything other than, the traditional, Talmud, there's a whole discussion, blah, blah. I'd love to get your sources. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you. So Jill also noted that the works of Josephus are in the B'nai Library if people are interested. I think it's personally fascinating because he is really a source from this Second Temple period, and I really recommend reading it. I think it's personally fascinating. And what's really interesting is that a lot of the quotes he has or the speeches he has, he defines as, I wasn't there, but if I was there, this is what should have been said. So it really is a different perspective of history than we now see it ourselves. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to note that is also from this time is the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran scrolls as well that you can find in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. These scrolls also had pieces of the Bible. They're from the 1st to 3rd century. And also another unique thing is that they're talking about a specific nation as well who saw the world as light and darkness. And they're basically a cult from the Jewish people. They lived in the Judean desert. They lived separately. And this is their way of describing, Judaism in a different way or describing the world in a different way as well. So those are the sources we have in Hebrew up until now. And I don't know why the 7th, that was the division I saw, 7th century. I know that I really touched upon a lot of sources that are pretty much from around the 1st century, more or less, but those are the kind of sources we're seeing at this point. Next, we have the Middle Ages. We jumped quite a lot, but we have a lot of different things that developed during this time, and that's why I said a lot of new developments. So first of all, we have commentary on the religious sources we've seen that have been canonized up until now. So Rashi is the person over here. He's from the 11th century, I think. He's from France. And his grandson, Rashbam, they both wrote in Hebrew because they both were connecting to the Bible themselves and the biblical sources and the traditional religious sources. In addition, we have kind of a book talking about religion, but it has become also a really central book as well, generally, which is the Kuzari. And it's written by Rabbi Yehuda Levi. I think also that's from the 12th century. And he wrote, the whole story is about this King Kuzar who wanted to hear what is the best religion. And he called 3 different religions. And in this book, he called a rabbi, he called a priest, and someone who was I guess an imam, so who Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, and asked them various questions about their religion. The result was at the end of the story or end of this book is that him and his whole nation convert to Judaism. And at the time that this was written, the purpose was basically for Jews to have them so that they have the reasons why they should keep their Jewish religion and maintain that strong connection to Judaism. At the same time, this also is written in Hebrew. It's another book that's really unique because there is some legend of a nation that's called Khuzar that converted to Judaism, and he just uses it as a way to talk about the wonderful things or the important notes to be aware of against other nations in Judaism specifically. This person over here actually represents something new that developed in the Middle Ages, which is Hebrew poetry. So this is Abraham ibn Ezra, which I actually learned some of this poetry when I was in high school. And he wrote really beautiful poetry also about Shabbat, but also things like wine and nature and love and people who are betraying you as friends. All of a sudden, we have this new genre that's introduced in Hebrew literature, which is Hebrew poetry in that case. So it's very classic. It would remind us of words that they use in the Bible, but we're adding really a whole new genre in the Middle Ages, which is the Hebrew poetry in that case. And those are the subjects they spoke about. A lot of it was religious, but if it wasn't, it was talking about friendship and family, betrayal, nature, and there was also a lot of songs about wine. So maybe there's a little bit of alcoholism then, who knows? And just want to, okay. Now jumping a little bit, we have in the 16th century, here I just want to, here somebody wrote in the chat. Oh, John is sharing with us because he's enjoying to do a little bit of self-promotion as well. He works for Mosaic Magazine. So he shared a little bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls from Mosaic Magazine, which I recommend because they do really in-depth articles. So if you're interested, so feel free to click on the link. So another thing we have a little bit later on from the 16th century is the first play in Hebrew by Yehuda Somo. I now can't, I don't have in front of me. I think the name is Jokes of Marriage, but this was also written in Hebrew in the 16th century. It's actually a pretty horrible story, in my opinion, but I'll briefly say what it was about so you can get a feel of what was the first Hebrew play ever written. It's about a man and a woman who are supposed to get married, and the father of the groom dies all of a sudden, and he left in his will all of his money to their slave or worker. And the son is left with nothing, and the bride wants to break off the engagement, but in the will, there is a catch. The son can take one item that belongs to his father out of all of his belongings, basically. And the son very cleverly decides to take the slave or the worker. And in that sense, because he did that, he gains all of the belongings and all of the money of the father because he now once again has basically all of what the slave owned or received. And then they get married. I think for many reasons, it's a horrible story, but that is the first play, and I think it's supposed to be funny. So I just think it's really interesting culturally that this is okay, because if you had a play like this today, it would be a no-go, especially if you had it today. So I thought that was really fascinating that was the first Hebrew play and it was a joke. Another interesting development that I will note before going to the next one, which is a whole new thing in of itself, is that once we're approaching the Renaissance era, which is around the 16th century, and towards also the modern era, which is around 18th century, we also have Hebrew newspapers. So the Hebrew newspapers appeared in Germany and Eastern Europe at the end of 1800s, and it went around Europe. But the newspapers had trouble because they were competing with newspapers that were in Yiddish and Ladino. So Yiddish is the Hebrew language, it's Hebrew combined with German, and Ladino is Hebrew combined with Spanish. So depending where they lived in their Jewish community, they would read newspapers in either Yiddish or Ladino. So they were coming out with Hebrew newspapers, and it was a new development, but they were also competing with these other newspapers and didn't actually succeed. But the fact that it came out goes to show us a change in society and how people were seeing Hebrew at the time. So I will note, that throughout this whole time, we of course, throughout this whole time, we of course have continuing religious commentary. Once Abraham Ibn Ezra begins with Hebrew poetry, that continues. All these different kinds of books and different kinds of new things that are introduced in certain periods of time continue as well. But I'm just noting the developments that are happening and when they do happen. Okay, so in the 1800s as well, we had this whole movement of people called the New Move. And it was people who were part of the Enlightenment movement in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, who, like the people around them, who were becoming more intellectual and studying more and being more academic, they wanted to create Hebrew and have Hebrew be more academic as well and more high level. And they were seeing that the Hebrew generally was not brought to that level. It was very black and white. There was no in-depth study and discussion in Hebrew, and they wanted to bring Hebrew literature to that level. So that is a short, it's a short explanation about this movement, but it really is important to be aware that during this time we have a group of people who are interested in bringing Hebrew to a higher level, and they created journals that were written in Hebrew on a higher level. And for Zionists who began operating at the time or during that century, basically, the fact that there was content that was high level in Hebrew and connected to academic and talking about today and in Hebrew as well, very much connected to certain streams of Zionism. And this book that we have here, which is called Ahavat Zion, which means love of Zion, is the first novel in Hebrew written by Avraham Mapu in Lithuania in 1853. I apologize, I didn't look into what it was about, but it looks like that it's a novel, and it looks like from the cover that it's a love story. And if anybody's interested, I can look into it afterwards, what specifically it is about. But our first Hebrew novel is 1853 in that case. Okay, so we've now reached basically probably the era that we all tend to refer to often when we're talking about Hebrew, because the revival of the Hebrew language took place in the 19th century, and the main person who did that was Eliezer ben Yehuda. He created new words for things like ice cream and doll and snake, things that snakes you have in the Bible, but all these things that you don't, or bottle, for example, all these things that you don't have in the Bible that we now say today and have become something that we talk about in our daily language, he had to create words for. And he's really the person who revived the Hebrew language. So often when we're looking at, Hebrew today and biblical Hebrew, we basically say, okay, there was the Bible, and there are these all religious documents, and then there's Eliezer ben Yehuda, and then that's it. But the point of what I did up until now is to show that there was already a Hebrew play in the 16th century. We have the first novel in 1853, probably during the time that Hebrew was being revived, and also when Eliezer ben Yehuda. But at the same time, this already happened. We have history already written beforehand. We have Hebrew poetry also written beforehand, just to give an idea that Hebrew did develop and was written over a long period of time. And even though it was revived once again, there were other languages that people mostly spoke. It had other uses throughout history, and it's important to be aware of that as well. Although it wasn't a language that a whole nation spoke like it is right now. So I'm now going to share a short video about Eliezer ben Yehuda to kind of give myself a little time to not talk, and also for you guys to not have to hear my voice all the time. So we both gain. Okay, so it's a minute and a half video, more or less. Great. And I'm going to share that one moment. Here we go. This is about Eliezer ben Yehuda, basically. I'll make it bigger. Here we go. So the video is very well done because it says in a minute and a half what I would probably say in a lot more time. So it's very helpful. Okay. Thank you, Taivo. I'm glad that you enjoy hearing my voice. Okay, so I will refer back to the, here we go. So the revival of the Hebrew language. So like it said, that Eliezer ben Yehuda, it wasn't just, it's so wonderful, let's learn Hebrew. People now are excited to learn Hebrew. I teach Hebrew so often to adults and kids, but it really wasn't like that when Eliezer ben Yehuda was reviving the language, basically. He had to deal with a lot of opposition, and it was from two sides. It wasn't from also ultra-Orthodox people who wanted to use Hebrew only for religious purposes. It was also from people who saw Yiddish as a language that was the cultural language. I mean, the fact that we have the forward in Yiddish up until today goes to show that Yiddish was really seen as the cultural Jewish language that we want to keep alive. And there's still a movement of people like that who think so today and really want to try to revive Yiddish and keep it alive as well. Doesn't mean that they oppose Hebrew, but it means that that movement still continues today. So that's Eliezer ben Yehuda on the top right. But there's another picture here because there's another thing that's important to be aware of that happened that really kind of changed and created the fact that Hebrew was the language that they were going to speak in Israel. So during Mandate Palestine, when the British were in charge, there were a lot of different schools for Jews that spoke different languages. You had French, you had English, you had Arabic. Each school chose what language they were going to speak. German as well, I think they spoke. And it wasn't a common thing that they were going to speak Hebrew. And this is actually the Technion, which then was called Technikum. And it was it was a high education school, so basically a university. Today, I don't know if then it was just for sciences, but today it's only for sciences studies. So my sister next year is going to be studying engineering there. And in 1913, it was going to be founded, and the board of directors of this school decided that the teaching language that was going to be in this school was German. In order to make it really a high-class school, to be international, to really reach that level that they wanted to reach regarding their teaching and education. However, the teachers themselves and the students went against that and wanted Hebrew to be the language. And actually, this whole debate is called the War of the Languages. And there even got in some cases to be violent verbally, and very, very rare cases physically as well. But it really was a war. There were people who really wanted it to be Hebrew and wanted to be speaking Hebrew in the land of Israel. And there were some people who really saw it as an opportunity to connect internationally to different institutions internationally and worldwide. So in the end of the day, it was agreed upon that they were going to be speaking Hebrew. And in 1922, when the British Mandate had an official decision regarding the land of Israel, regarding the Jewish People's Council and the Arab People's Council, that they function side by side. So during the British Mandate, you had two different councils for the two different people, because the British plan was to create two separate states side by side. That was the original plan. And they defined the Jewish People's Council that their official three languages are Hebrew, English, and Arabic. And that is the way it still remains today. So if you see street signs, if you see names of committees in the Knesset, all the official signs are in Hebrew, in English, and Arabic. So that remained basically since 1922. And it started with Eliezer ben Yehuda, but really that war of the languages determined that Hebrew was going to be the language spoken in Israel. And I'm mentioning that, and I'm mentioning these two people because they really influenced the fact that Hebrew literature developed so much. And more importantly, what helped develop Hebrew literature so much and creating it into Israeli literature is the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. And in fact, after 1948, we have different waves of Israeli literature that have developed over time. And in the background that I have here is the picture of the first, or one of the first, of the Hebrew book weeks. So if you were here last week, or if you were my Jewish history session last week, I mentioned that this began in the celebrations of the first decade of Israel. So meaning 1958, more or less, is when they decided that Israel was going to have a Hebrew book week, meaning that after its first decade, Israel put on a pedestal the idea of having Hebrew literature. And yes, although today we have books in different languages, at the time originally, the purpose and the focus was books and literature that are in Hebrew. And once that happened, that really changed the way the perspective and encouraged people to be writing in Hebrew. And that is the true transformation at the end of the day. But at the same time, we have a lot of Hebrew literature that appears beforehand as well. Of course, the founding of the State of Israel created a whole new wave of other and additional books too. So these are the names of the different generations. I'll be going through them briefly, which is why they're all on one slide. And then I'll be summarizing, and we will, I'll take questions as well. And I'm sorry for not mentioning this before, but if people have questions, feel free to use the chat, and I appreciate that people have already been using it. So the first generation is the 1948 generation. It's also called the Palmach generation. So many people who were living in Israel before its foundation, they were part of an organization that before the IDF, the main security, military, paramilitary, guerrilla group, some people call as well, that was active in the State of Israel was the Palmach. There were other two small organizations that were more extreme, but the Palmach's idea was that they were more defensive during operations and against the British and the Arabs, whereas the other two organizations that existed were more offensive, and they wanted to physically attack people, groups, and initiate and take more of the action, basically. So they were called the Palmach generation because they were involved in this group before and prior to the founding of the State of Israel. And they really determined, and this group of authors really determined or talked about being in the foundation of Israel and determined the language that was being used as well. However, there are two other groups that are part of the 1948 generation. One is survivors from the Holocaust, or people who were from the Second World War and came to Israel and immigrated. Despite the fact that there were a lot of testimonies being written, what was put on the pedestal and put on the focus were stories of fighting, of rebellion, of partisans. If you've been to my other lectures about Holocaust, I've mentioned beforehand that when Israel first founded, they wanted to focus on the new Jew, the fighting Jew, who was the pioneer, who took the destiny in their hands, that weren't just led off like all the pogroms and murdered. They fought for themselves. So that's what the new country wanted to put at the center. They wanted to put the idea that we are the fighting Jew. And yes, there were testimonies that were being written, but the testimonies that spoke about the fighting were the ones that got main focus in Israel during that first generation. The last thing was that you had other books of immigrants generally, that they spoke about their country of origin, but also how it was to be this new pioneer in Israel. So those are the three type of genres we see happening in the 1948 generation. The new wave is from the 1960s, and it is based on 1967, the Six-Day War, and also the Sinai War, which was from 1956. And it's called the new wave because they focus more on the individual than society in general. They also created characters that were anti-heroes and not just heroes. And they were influenced on philosophies and put more depth and controversial issues into their writing. So just because I recognize the names as well, so I'm going to mention some authors. Part of this generation are Amos Oz. So if you think about what he's written, you can think about a little bit more controversy in what he writes. Aaron Appelfeld, he wrote a lot of books that were fiction about the Holocaust, and he spoke about difficult decisions and experiences that people had to face in the Second World War or in the Holocaust generally. And also Shulamit Lapid, who writes novels, historical novels about the foundation of Israel. And also, again, this focuses on more individuals and their experiences rather than the society as a whole, although it does have to do with what's going on in society in general. Another thing that's important to note is that we have a development of Hebrew poetry as well. So two people that are important to mention are Yehuda Amichai, who are part of the 1960s New Wave generation, and Yona Volach as well. And Amichai is also known for being kind of controversial and critical in his words as well. So we really see that change happening in the 1960s and with this new wave. And another thing that I want to show really quickly is, and Jill will answer your question afterwards. So another thing I want to refer to is that 1966 is when Shai Agnon, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, received the Nobel Prize. And he actually shared it with another German Jewish poet named Nelly Zakash. If I read her name correctly, I apologize if somebody here knows I didn't. Please correct me. And I wanted to just show really quickly the clip from that, because I think personally that it's nice to watch. So I'll just show that really quickly. I'm only showing part of it. Okay, one moment. So even though there's no sound in the beginning, this is Shai Agnon over here and receiving it. So you can see, I think it's pretty moving to see what happens. The woman standing over there is the person who also got the Nobel Prize. That's it. I just wanted to show that because it looks so humble, in my opinion. It looks very appreciative. And also you have that huge black kippah on his head, which is so prominent. I think that, if you look at other pictures, there's no prominent kippah on his head generally when he's taking pictures. So the fact that that's how he chose to come to the Nobel Literature Prize. If I said Peace Prize, I'm sorry. The Nobel Prize for Literature, of course. So I think that has a lot of meaning. And also that really changed the way Hebrew literature and Israeli literature was seen, because it put it put it as a world-renowned international language and literature generally, which was not the way beforehand it was seen. Hebrew literature was all of a sudden recognized by the world. So that really is a really important changing point to note. And then we have, oops, I didn't share it. Then we have two more waves that I'll say briefly, and I see we already are in 4:43. So I'll be wrapping up soon. So the realistic wave is from 1973. 1973 was the Yom Kippur War. And it's called the realistic wave because of that. The 1973 war was a shock to many people. Israel was not prepared for the war. Golda Meir stepped down after the war because of that shame or that recognition that they were not prepared for the war. And examples of authors we have who started in this time are David Grossman, Eli Amir, Chaim Be'er, and Meir Shalev as well. So they're part of this realistic or sobered wave of people who wrote also in a more critical way and saw reality in a different situation, or saw Israel in a different situation than people who were before them. Theater also developed during this time. And another interesting thing that happened for the first time in this generation is homosexual poetry. That's how it was defined. That you have a different genre developing in Hebrew poetry as well. The last wave we have is the different wave, which are authors from the second half of the 80s and the 90s as well. This was defined by other authors of the time, and people who we have, known authors who are part of this period are Eshkol Nevo, Edgar Keret, and Mira Magen, just as an example. I was trying to look for specifics regarding what is new about this specific wave, and I couldn't really find. I'll just say that the perspective is obviously different given the fact that they're writing, in the 80s and 90s. Edgar Keret is known for his short stories that are kind of wacky. Mira Magen also writes, not historic novels that are more in-depth, multi-generational. You have different kind of writing that is maybe more connected to what other authors are doing worldwide as well, and it's more globalized, I guess. Which brings us to today, but I didn't put a picture for names of books from today, but we definitely have a wide variety of literature we see today, and also popularized literature that we see today, which also connects to what we're going to be talking about next week, which is popular books in Israel and popular books that have become popular Israeli books that have become popular worldwide. So on one hand, we have people like Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote history books, and his words have been translated into many languages. And just doing a little search about him, I saw that he sat with Natalie Portman and he sat with Russell Brand, who are two known actors. So the fact that somebody who is a professor at Hebrew University and is able to sit down and be so world-renowned like that really goes to show how Israeli literature has developed and has become something that is really looked at seriously. And on the other hand, we have people who are using, nowadays to become more controversial. There's an author named Yochi Brandes. So she wrote a book called Kings 3. And it is basically an interpretation of the two books of Kings that appeared in the Bible. And I really wanted to reference that because I think it really goes to show a unique development we see today. It's a historic novel that really talks about a biblical book, but it gives a little twist. And when I was in high school, when it came out, it was known that if you read this book, you're going to hate King David. That's what it causes you to do. And it really is true. I now hate King David as a character, but that's what the book did. And it really gives you a different perspective of how to read this book. So from the Bible, we reach up until today to somebody who's writing a historic novel about the Bible and being pretty critical of some certain characters and giving a different perspective that people who would read the Bible would not see. So that's kind of the development we have from the Bible up until today. And I wanted to share a trailer, but I think we'll do that next time, also considering the time. But I just want to summarize before I take questions and just say that we can really see that the Hebrew literature developed from the Bible up until today. from being just the Bible and commentary and religious commentary about the Bible or oral law, we really have seen that it develop, from history with Josephus to Hebrew poetry with Abraham ibn Ezra to the first Jewish play, to Hebrew newspapers, and to the revival of the Hebrew language, which is what most of us know, and then to the development of the founding of the state of Israel and the different waves of Hebrew literature, which basically became Israeli literature from pretty much a decade after Israel was founded, with the foundation of the Hebrew Book Week, which is why we're all here right now marking and talking about Israeli literature. So that is pretty much an overview of the development of Hebrew literature to Israeli literature. And for next week, it'll be at 7:30 p.m. Same link though, but just later on in the day. And we'll be talking about, along with Jill, popular books in Israel and popular Israeli books all over the world. So I'd be happy now to take questions. So I'm going to look now, and Jill asked, when did they start referring to the Jews as the Sabras? So the Jews referred to themselves as Sabras pretty much since its foundation. It was a thing that also, yes, they're prickly outside and the sweet fruit from inside, but also why they chose the Sabra, because its origin is from Israel. It's in the desert. It talks about being that pioneer. It's originated in Israel. And when they founded the state, they wanted to create a new person. They wanted to create a melting pot. Yes, people are coming from all over the place. They're immigrants, but they're going to speak Hebrew. They're going to be the Jew that we want them to be, and they're going to be a Sabra. So that term was pretty much used since Israel was founded, more or less, by the Israelis themselves, because they wanted to define that new personality they wanted to mold people into. And I think that the good example of that, there's this cartoon named Dosh that he has he has the pants. I'm going to try to find it right now really quickly. Dosh. Oh no, I think it's called Shmulik, maybe. Shmulik Dosh. 1 second. Here, let me try to find it really quickly. Here we go. I found it. 1 moment. Here we go. Nope. Here we go. So this picture over here. So this is like the Israeli Sabra. This was the cartoon that was shown all the time. He has the hat, he has the pants, he has the sandals as well. This is the Sabra. Okay, so, okay. Tybal, do you want to just ask your question?
The Ruth Calderon one?
There's a couple. Is this when he said the blessing for being in the presence of a king?
Oh, right. I forgot about that, because what I had heard was that he wasn't in good health. And when he was asked why he was going all the way, because he said there was a blessing he'd never been able to say, and he wanted to be able to say it.
It probably is that in that case. I'm not sure. I can check, but.
No, don't check.
Yeah.
No, don't check. It's easy to check. It's just that's something that
you remember hearing.
Well, but it just shows to me the power of the blessing and the power of the culture, that someone, given who he was worth, in a way, despite his health, going for the ritual of saying yet another blessing.
Yes.
He didn't say the honor. He said, I want to be able to say the blessing in front of a king.
Yes.
Anyway.
It's very interesting. I don't think I know who. So I worked in a bookstore. That was my first job right out of high school and also out of the army as well. So I know Ruth Calderon, but I don't know what book you're referring to, and I'm not sure I read it myself, so I can't comment on it.
As a very old person who reads a lot, I have this rule from a few years ago that I won't buy a book unless I know I want to read it more than once. And I've been looking for it on Interlibrary Loan. I'll look it up and I'll send it to you. She wrote it maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
And people refer to it all the time. It's something about a bride for a night, but I'll look it up.
Okay, so I'm sure if I see the cover or I see a little description, I probably will know it because I probably recommended it to people. With that, that's how we do it. We recommend books according to genres without reading them.
Right. Well, but here she is. She's a member of Knesset, and she also, well, I don't think she is anymore, but she was a member of Knesset, and
Yeah.
here she is with this novel that got translated that everybody raves about.
Okay. So I'll be happy to hear about it because I haven't myself. Okay, so I see people are leaving, which is totally fine because we've kind of summarized. And please let me know if you have any questions before leaving. And Tybal, yeah, please send to me the book because I'd be happy to hear. A Bride for One Night. I probably have to check it because I don't. Oh, thanks, Shelly, for sending it. I don't know what it is on top of my head. I probably have to see how it's called in Hebrew and also what the cover looks like to kind of think of it. But not on top of my head, I don't know. So, but I encourage you to read Hebrew books or books translated. They're really good. I always myself do Hebrew English. I really enjoy it, and there's a lot to read. So I'll ask one more time if there's any other questions, and then we'll end. Okay. Thank you, Jill. Appreciate it. And I wish you all a great afternoon and see you next week at 7:30 p.m. Bye.